My son said the baby wasn't his. So I decided to take in the 19-year-old girl he left behind, because she had nobody in this world, and I wasn't going to pretend that was okay. Let me tell you how this started, because it didn't start with a dramatic fight or a big family meeting. It started quietly, the way most life-changing things do, with a phone call I almost didn't answer on a Thursday evening in October. My name is Helen and I was 50 years old when my son Ryan called me to tell me that his girlfriend was pregnant, and that he was done. Those were his words, that he was done. Not that he was scared, not that he needed time to think, not that he didn't know what to do. Done. Like it was a project he had decided to abandon. Not a human being he had helped create, and not a young woman who had trusted him completely. I asked him about Brenda. He said she would figure it out. I asked him if he was sure the baby was his, and he said he wasn't, which I knew was a lie the moment he said it because Ryan had been with Brenda for over a year, and I had met her twice, and she was not the kind of girl who needed to be lied about. She was quiet and gentle, and she painted the most beautiful watercolors I had ever seen. Little landscapes and flowers that she gave away, because she didn't think they were good enough to keep. She was 19 years old and she had grown up in foster care, and she had no family, no safety net, no one to call when things fell apart. Ryan had known all of that when he started dating her. And he had walked away anyway. I drove to her apartment 2 days after that phone call. She was living in a small one-bedroom place on the edge of town. The kind of apartment that is technically furnished but feels completely empty. And when she opened the door she looked like someone who had been crying for 48 hours straight, and had only recently stopped because she had run out of energy. She was barely showing yet. She had a part-time job at a coffee shop that paid just enough to cover her rent if nothing unexpected happened. And something very unexpected had just happened. I told her to put the kettle on and I sat down at her kitchen table and I said, I am not here to apologize for my son, because there is no apology that covers this. I am here because you are carrying my grandchild, and because you don't have anyone and I do not know how to drive away from this building and go back to my normal life knowing that. She looked at me for a long time without saying anything. And then she said, Why would you do that? He left. You don't owe me anything. And I said, I know I don't. I'm doing it anyway. What followed over the next 7 months was not easy, and I am not going to pretend it was. Brenda moved into my house in November because her lease was ending and the math on her salary simply didn't work for a baby. Ryan knew she had moved in because small towns don't keep secrets. And he called me once to tell me I was making a mistake, and that I was choosing a stranger over my own son. I told him I was choosing his child, which was not the same thing, and that when he was ready to be a father I would be the first person he called. He hung up and I didn't hear from him again for a very long time. Noah was born in April, on a Tuesday morning, after a labor that lasted 14 hours, and that I was present for every single minute of because Brenda had asked me to be there, and I had said yes without hesitating. He was 7 pounds and 4 ounces, and he had Ryan's nose and Ryan's ears and Ryan's exact expression of mild outrage at being somewhere he hadn't chosen. And I held him in that hospital room, and I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't known was unsettled. Brenda looked at him and then looked at me and said, He looks like Ryan. And I said, I know. And neither of us said anything else about it for a while, because there was nothing else to say that the moment hadn't already said for us. We settled into a life together, the three of us, in a way that surprised me with how natural it felt. Brenda was a good mother from the very first day. Instinctive and patient and completely devoted in a way that made sense when you understood that she had spent her whole childhood without someone being devoted to her, and had decided, somewhere deep and unspoken, that her child was never going to feel that way. She went back to studying when Noah was 8 months old, pursuing a teaching degree with a focus on art, because she was gifted and she had always known it, but had never had anyone tell her clearly enough that it was worth pursuing. I watched Noah during her classes. I watched him on weekends when she needed to study. I watched him gladly, because he was funny and curious and stubborn in a way that was so familiar it sometimes made my heart hurt in a complicated direction. Ryan's name came up occasionally, in the way that absent things come up, sideways briefly, and then set back down. Noah asked about his father when he was around 3. The way 3-year-olds ask about things they sense are missing without knowing exactly what they are. I told him that his father wasn't able to be here right now but that he was loved, which was true on at least one side of the equation. Brenda handled it with more grace than I would have managed in her position. She never said anything bitter. She just said that sometimes families look different from each other, and that ours looked like this, him and her and me. And that was enough. It was enough. For all three of us, for a long time, it genuinely was. When Noah was 4.5, Brenda met a man named James at a community art exhibition where she was showing her work for the first time. He was a high school history teacher, calm and steady, and the kind of person who asked real questions and actually listened to the answers. He came to the exhibition because a colleague had dragged him there, and he stayed for 2 hours because of Brenda's paintings, and then asked if he could call her. She told me about him the next morning over coffee, cautiously, like she was testing how the words felt before she committed to them. I told her that was wonderful, and I meant it completely. She had been alone for 5 years, raising Noah with nothing but her own strength and whatever I could offer. And she deserved someone who saw her clearly and chose her deliberately. James was good with Noah from the beginning, which was the only thing that actually mattered. He didn't try too hard or move too fast. He just showed up consistently and let Noah set the pace. And Noah, who was a perceptive child in the way that children who have been closely observed tend to become perceptive themselves, decided within about 3 months that James was acceptable, and within 6 that he was good. Brenda and James got married 2 years later in my backyard. A small ceremony with close friends and Noah in a little suit that he complained about for the entire morning, and then forgot about completely once there was cake. I stood next to Brenda while she said her vows, and I thought about that Thursday evening 7 years earlier when Ryan had called me to say he was done. And I thought about how many things had grown in the space his leaving had opened up. A year after the wedding, Brenda had twin girls. The house that had once felt too quiet for just me suddenly had more noise in it than I had ever known. And I was not sorry about a single decibel. Noah was 7 by then, confident and kind and deeply attached to his twin sisters in the protective way that older brothers sometimes are when they feel they have a role to play. He called James Dad, which had happened gradually and naturally and without any formal conversation. Just one day the word was there, and it stayed. And he called me Grandma Helen, which he had always done, and which still made me feel like something I hadn't expected to become, but was entirely glad to be. That was the life we had built. Quietly, without anyone's permission or approval, out of a situation that should have produced only damage. And then Ryan came back. He appeared at my front door on a Saturday morning in November, 7 years after he had last spoken to me with any seriousness. He was 32 now and he looked tired in a way that went deeper than sleep, the kind of tired that comes from years of choices that didn't work out the way you planned. I opened the door and looked at him and waited. He said he needed to talk. I let him in. We sat in the kitchen and he told me he was in serious financial trouble. Debt he had accumulated over several years, a business that had failed, a situation that had become genuinely desperate. And then he said what he had come to say, which was that he wanted me to sell the house and give him the money, because the house was worth enough to clear what he owed and he was my son and he needed help. I listened to all of it without interrupting. And when he finished I asked him one question. I asked him when, in the 7 years that had passed, he had called to ask how I was. Not to ask for anything, just to ask how I was. He didn't answer that. I told him I was not going to sell the house. I told him this house was where his son had learned to walk and where Brenda had studied for her teaching exams at my kitchen table, and where 2 little girls had come home from the hospital, and where a life had been built by people who had chosen to build it together. And I was not going to sell it to solve a problem he had created for himself. He got angry then. He said I had replaced him with a girl who had tricked him, and a child that wasn't his. He said I had chosen strangers over my own blood. He said the boy wasn't his son and never had been, and I had thrown away my relationship with my own child for a lie. I looked at my son across my kitchen table and I said, Noah has your nose. He has your ears. He has your exact way of narrowing his eyes when he's thinking about something hard. He is yours in every way that matters, and you have missed 7 years of him because you decided he wasn't convenient. That is not something I did to you. That is something you did to yourself. Ryan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Does he know about me? I said, He knows he has a father who wasn't able to be there. That's all he knows, because that's all I could say honestly. Ryan looked at the table. He looked at his hands. And then he said something I had not expected him to say. He said, "I'd like to meet him." I told him that was not my decision to make. I told him that Noah had a mother and a father who loved him, and a life that was full and stable. And that if Ryan wanted to be part of that life in any capacity, he would need to speak to Brenda and James, and he would need to do it humbly, and without any expectation of what the answer would be. I told him I would not stand in the way of that conversation, but I would not arrange it for him either. He was 32 years old, and this was his to figure out. He nodded. He stood up. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. At the door he stopped and turned around and said, "You were a better mother to her than I deserved you to be." I said, "I know. Go home, Ryan." He left. I closed the door and stood in my hallway for a minute, and then I went back to the kitchen and finished my coffee. That evening Brenda came over for Sunday dinner the way she did every week, with James and Noah and the twins, and the house was full of the particular noise that family makes when it is comfortable enough to be loud. And Noah sat next to me the way he always did and stole food off my plate the way he always did, and I let him the way I always did. I raised a son who couldn't rise to the moment when it mattered. But that son gave me a grandson who is the best thing in my life, and a young woman who calls me mom like she has been doing it her whole life. And on balance, looking around that table on that Sunday evening, I will take that trade every single time.